as I did in the last section, it's real important in presenting these kinds of sessions, these kinds of teachings, that one has a proper motivation and intent in terms of both listening to this type of teaching and then also, for me, teaching it. So the motivation and intent that one should carry is to be doing this not just for your own benefit, but also for the benefit of all people, all sentient beings ideally. As we look at the wheel of life, we can see that there's sentient beings in many realms, not just the human realm. Even if we just look at those we could see, like animals and insects and all of those things that we know. So the other thing that maybe I neglected to say at the beginning of the last session I did was that, these teachings are based on the Buddha's Wheel of Life teaching, which I know I did say, but what I didn't say probably is that although we're following the use of certain texts, for the benefit of those who might want to read and follow along and do some further contemplation beyond listening to what I have to offer, there are those texts which were given out in the course outline. They're posted at the class website on the DNK, on the class listing page on the DNKL website. And then also for anything that I might share with you, I will try to always be clear that it's information that I've learned from either my teachers or from study. And if it's something that's my own opinion, derived from my own study and experience, I'll try to note that. And that if there are any mistakes that I make, they're all my own. They're not like a fault of the teaching. And if we discover any of those along the way, I'll effort to provide correct information. So with all that said, and that's traditional in our lineage to state that if you're someone who's presenting a teaching. It's not my teaching, it's a teaching of what has come down from the Buddha to teachers throughout the ages, including my current teachers, Geshe Darge and Kensor, Gyurme Kensor Rinpoche. So with that said, this session 2, I'm going to try to focus mostly on what I call the inner circles of the wheel. The very inner circle, which is known, as we talked about last time, as 3 poisons, or the 3 primary mental afflictions of ignorance, or what you might start to hear me call more often in these sessions, misapprehension. It's a kinder word than ignorance. Ignorance has a lot of interesting connotations attached to it in Western culture and certainly in Western languages, not so much in Sanskrit and Tibetan, especially in the context of Buddhism, but we're doing this teaching in English. So you might hear me say that. So the inner wheel, the inner circle of the wheel, which is the pig, which represents misapprehension or ignorance, the rooster, which represents the mental affliction of attachment, and then the snake, which represents the mental affliction of aversion. So one thing to note as well is I did give some readings to sort of go along with this class. I'll loosely follow the readings. So if you haven't read the readings, it's fine. If you have, I'll try to note where I'm referencing the readings specifically and also where I'm not and where I might be skipping. So right now, I'm just giving an overview of what I'm going to try to cover in this session. So again, the inner circle is going to be my primary focus in this talk. It is so important to talk about the inner circle of the 3 poisons a little more substantively. It's like that foundation of understanding that will shed, I think, a brighter light not only the rest of the wheel and the description of what is in the rest of the wheel, but why the way the rest of the wheel is constructed makes sense from a how life works perspective and how we could apply that to our lives. So as promised last week, the first session was an outline or overview of the entire wheel. In these follow-up sessions, we'll be doing a lot of focus on specific parts and the way the wheel works in terms of function and what it tells us about how life works. It starts in the center at the 3 poisons. We won't actually talk too much about the second part of the wheel. Probably should bring this up on the screen while I'm talking so you don't have to just look at me. So I'll do that real quick. All right, let's see. So you all can see this, I hope. So I was just talking about the inner circle of the wheel, the 3 poisons. The next circle is the one that's split in half. There's the dark and light side with entities or beings going down on the dark side, up on the right, on the other side. We talked about that a little bit last week. We're going to circle back to talking about the 2 halves of this, what's called a negative and positive activities circle that surround the inner circle of the 3 poisons. We'll circle back on this circle actually in the next session. It's not like we can't talk about it during this session, and it might seem odd to skip it. It's not a matter of skipping it. It's a matter of the way I want to teach or propose a view of seeing what the 3 poisons really are and how they actualize in our mental state, our emotional state, our psychological state, one of the realms of existence, or the 6 realms, as David Nichtern calls it in his book. And that's the next circle, which in this diagram you can't see fully, but it's the ones that surround the half circle of positive and negative. The 3 realms on the top half of the circle being what are called the higher realms, and the 3 on the lower half of that particular set of circles being the lower realms, the ones on the top being the higher realms. So there's going to be more focus on those 2 circles. So I just wanted to make that clear and frame it out for you, so you in case you start to wonder. Beyond that, there will be less focus, and actually I'll be trying to avoid talking about the outer circle, which is the 12 links of dependent origination. Yes, I will be talking about dependent origination in this class, but everything that we talk about over the next few sessions that talk about the more detailed investigation of the inner circles lead to the reality, if you will, on the foundation of understanding those inner circles, how the 12 links of dependent origination actually work, and how we move from one to the other, not only in a Buddhist context from lifetime to lifetime, but how we can move from any one of them from moment by moment, day by day, month by month, year by year in this life, which, as I accentuated in our last session, the first session, is that will be a big part of what I'm trying to relate the wheel to, which is how we experience this life. What are our emotional, psychological, physical frames of reference moment by moment, and how those can be explored and taken into consideration for how we practice and maybe go about making some changes with that sort of knowledge. So that's an overview of like where we're going from this class to the next ones. So with that said, I will start to talk a little bit more in more detail right now about the inner circle, the three poisons, and how that is really the most foundational aspect of the view that the wheel has to offer about how life actually works. And in order to do that, when we talk about those three imagery, iconic imageries that exist inside that inner circle, the pig, the rooster, and the snake, we are going to focus first and foremost on the pig. As we talked about previously, that's an iconic imagery-wise representation of ignorance, or what I like to call misapprehension. And it is of the three poisons, these three mental afflictions, it's considered the root affliction. So we're going to explore like why it's considered the root affliction and what's its actual nature as it relates to who we are, how our minds work, how we function moment by moment with that presence, that constant presence of misapprehension. So at this point, I will jump over to the readings that we were doing this session. That His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about in the chapter reading that we had for today, which is the Buddhist worldview, specifically to talk about one of the tools that we are going to need to know and utilize to explore every aspect of the wheel, and starting obviously with an exploration of ignorance or misapprehension. So in the book, His Holiness on page 34, the print edition, for those of you who've read it or are following along, not necessary if you have, I'll cover it here. What's discussed by His Holiness at the beginning of this, his teaching on this, is the importance of meditation. And the fact that he covers this at the beginning of his teaching on the importance of meditation, it's important. His Holiness, as we established last week, is someone in the context of this teaching to be an authority, and someone who we should sort of take like how he positions this teaching seriously. So some of you know this, but I need to cover it for all of us who are attending. There's two types of meditation. One is analytical, and the other is what sometimes is called, His Holiness calls it in this teaching, stabilizing. So the analytical is when you are meditating on an object in your mind and you are analyzing it. Usually that analysis is based on having listened to, read, studied, sort of mentally or intellectually processed something about that object to get familiar with it. It's really important to just sit down and start meditating on an object in meditation without that is similar to that analogy I did in the last session where I talked about deciding that, you know, I'm going to go climb Mount Everest and not prepare properly by having the proper tools and the proper training. So this is one of the reasons His Holiness says that meditation is really important. And what I'm going to try to do here is to tell you why it's important and how it actually works in the process of discovering what the wheel has to offer. So a lot of the objects of meditation are going to be what we study here, what we learn about here, what we read about in these books that we then can reflect on and then bring that quality of that object, that knowledge of that object into the analytical meditative process. And we'll be doing some of those meditations, so it will be less just blah, 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 you know. The other flip side, or the progression, not so much the flip side of analytical meditation, is stabilizing meditation. That's when you have an object that you've taken into meditation and you become really familiar with it. So much so that you can rest your mind on it in a very focused way without continuing to analyze it with your mind. It's a familiarity. So it kind of takes the foundation of the knowledge of the object and builds upon it by sitting with it and becoming personally and experientially familiar with it, and just resting with that single pointedly, ideally, where you're not having your mind go all over the place and having your mind be too excited or too dull, where you're kind of not focused on it, but you're distracted. So these are the two main types of meditation that are practiced in all meditations in Buddhism, not just this. And then from there, we start to explore what actually is what we're going to try to bring into focus in this particular meditation. So where we want to go here is back to the wheel, back to the pig representing misapprehension of what? I use that word. Or if we want to use the word ignorance, it's ignorance of what? His Holiness talks about having a goal be of meditation, whether it's this topic or any other topic, but especially this topic of ignorance, of using the meditation on ignorance or misapprehension as a vehicle for taming one's mental continuum. So, you know, we need to explore, like, what is one's mental continuum? You know, what's the nature of it? Is it something that we can identify and we can understand what it is? And what exactly are we taming? You know, in the context of the teaching of that the wheel has to offer, and specifically this circle in the wheel, we are looking to tame ignorance or misapprehension, attachment, which is represented by the rooster, and aversion, which is represented by the snake, and, along with the rest of the mental afflictions. And the first thing we have to understand why His Holiness talks about putting these mental afflictions into the context of one's mental continuum is basically what he's telling us is that these are ever present, every single moment. These mental states, or what we call mental afflictions. So when I talk about these three poisons, I'll use that phrase less than I'll talk about mental afflictions. These are mental conditions that we all can relate to, and if we get a firm understanding of how they're functioning, where they're functioning relative to us, we can bring them into focus and maybe work with them. His Holiness, again, talks about taming one's mental continuum. And why he says it needs to be tamed is that because it is veiled by the ongoing, like moment by moment. You know, I talked about last time karma and karmic ripening. And every single moment there's seeds being planted, or what in Sanskrit's call kleshas, like constantly. That's the mental continuum. That's like the tiger that's, you know, out of control in our mind, or actually more like the monkey that's out of control in our mind, jumping all over the place and grabbing onto things, pushing other things away, and being indifferent to other things. So I wanted to contextualize what His Holiness is talking about there when he talks about exactly what is it that we're trying to tame. Why does my mind have to be tamed? So one might be able to see that those could be classified those three characteristics of misapprehension, attachment, and aversion as mental afflictions. We could explore that more. We don't have to just accept that. But that's what the wheel is teaching us. And it's teaching us that we need to look at ways to understand how our mental continuum works, how we constantly are bringing these states of mind to bear on how we see our world in any one of the 6 realms that we discussed that emanate out from the 3 poisons and the activities of positive and negative, which we talked about last week, which is the second circle. And how do they actualize our environment and us? And can they be worked with? And can they be adjusted? Can they be changed? Is their nature fixed, or is there nothing we can do about them? These are all things that we'll try to explore here today. So His Holiness talks about what we're trying to do is fundamentally we're trying to tame our minds by removing, or maybe we might say transforming from our mind stream, from our continuum, these qualities. These qualities are really something that we're doing habitually all the time. The big one is misapprehending how we see the world, what its true nature is, and that leading to self-grasping, self-cherishing, and maybe we have the ability to transform that moment-by-moment experience of self-cherishing or self-grasping into a quality that, I'll use a word, it's opposite, which in Buddhism is compassion. It's why compassion is so important. It's why His Holiness talks about the way for us to be happy as individuals is to make other people happy. That's the essence of compassion. So maybe this is the idea of transforming our self-grasping into compassion. So how do we do this? As I mentioned, in Buddhism, compassion is the root of Buddhist teaching, practicing compassion. And so much so that if you read stories about the Buddha, the historic Buddha, it's said that the Buddha was actually born from compassion itself. That compassion gave birth to the Buddha, literally. That's what motivated the Buddha's incarnation as the Buddha. That's pretty powerful. So, that sort of compassion is what we call great compassion, where you're living your life for the benefit of others. And that is your sole purpose with your action, speech, and mind to do that. Remembering that that's one of the things that we'll use as a tool is compassion as a counterweight or transformative experience to counter self-grasping is something that we will rely upon as we move forward. So what we want to do at this point is look at understanding the 3 poisons a little bit better. So when we talk about ignorance or misapprehension, there's sort of 2 levels for how we misapprehend what we experience moment by moment. And I'm going to talk about them separately but connected. And I'm going to say 2 phrases here, two concepts here. One is emptiness and karma. So these are sort of the 2 aspects of how life really exists that we don't see clearly as we move moment by moment through our existence. And this is what we're looking to explore in the realm of what we're trying to move from, which is that misapprehension. Getting clarity on what karma is and getting clarity on what the nature of things are, which is what, to a Buddhist, that's what the word emptiness signifies, is really the foundation of moving forward and understanding why we self-grasp, why we have attachment, and why we have aversion to other things, and maybe why that isn't how we want to function. And the reason why maybe that's not the way we want to function is it causes suffering. I think if we analyze in our own lives how we experience life, we could look at ourselves, do self-analysis, and see that a lot of what we experience moment by moment, that is our suffering, which takes a myriad of shapes and forms, can be tied to having ourselves either pushing something away, averting it, or grabbing onto it and not wanting to let go, if you will. So we're going to talk about both of these concepts here, because what we're addressing, right, is what is ignorance? And how do we first identify it intellectually and process it from there? And so karma, as it relates to how life works, is a really, it sounds simple. I think most of us think we know what karma is, but karma is something that is not readily present to us moment by moment in terms of thinking about where that we're experiencing karmic cause and effect events, momentary events on an ongoing streaming basis, if you will. It's just not something that we're aware of. And having that awareness is one of the knowledges about how life works, and therefore an antidote to ignorance or misapprehension. In some ways, His Holiness says, not in this teaching, but in other teachings he's done that I've attended, he talks about karma and emptiness together. They are connected. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. And he talks about it where he says, if you had a choice right now to understand one or the other, it's much more important to understand karma than it is to understand emptiness or the true nature of things. And in some ways, he continues and says that it's harder to understand in many ways than emptiness of all things. But it's more important. And why do you think he might say that? He says it because it's something that functions right in our face in a very powerful and moving way, moment by moment in our lives. So not having an understanding of how that's functioning within our moment by moment experience, you could see how important it might be to overcoming or creating an antidote to misapprehension of how things really work, or ignorance. So karma is really important to understand. So, with that said, I'll just talk about karma and the basis for karma very quickly. Karma in Sanskrit literally means action or doing. In Buddhism, karma really refers to the action driven by intention. It's like what is in your mind that propels your thoughts, propels your speech, propels your actions, again, moment by moment. And as that activity is happening within yourself, what is actually taking place is that you are grasping onto those things, those thoughts, those utterances of speech, those actions driven by your fundamental intention, your volition of like what you're doing And it's actually the self-grasping to those things as having some sort of misapprehended nature that sort of makes it stick or gets planted in your mind, your consciousness, your flow, your stream of consciousness. Planted in the sense that it is something that stays there, you hold on to it. I mean, I'm being as sort of purposeful as possible using that phrase self-grasping. In Buddhism, we like to talk about how we self-grasp at things. And it's in the intention that we have moment by moment as we're moving through life that we grasp onto things and other people, ourselves, things, other things, phenomena. And that is the bed, the soil that these actions of thought, speech, and body are planted. And they get watered, so to speak, nurtured by our continual misrepresentation or misapprehension of them, along with self-grasping to them. And this is how karma takes hold. It's what's called the cause part of karma. And in the sense that it has another part, which is it has effect. Everybody's heard the expression cause and effect in relationship to karma. It is a future after that karmic seed's been planted, or that klesha's been planted. And I'll talk about kleshas in a second. And then it has a chance to be nurtured in that soil of self-grasping and continued adherence to misapprehension of things. It grows, just like an apple seed will grow into an apple tree, or an acorn will grow into an oak tree. So not only does it stay there with you in the stream of your consciousness, but it grows and gets bigger and it matures. And it becomes something bigger, stronger, more powerful, so to speak. And that's the ripening process. When it's fully ripened, it is the result. So every cause that we experience with our intention, moment by moment, that's planted through thoughts, speech, or actions, ripens the way I just described. And then actually, when it's fully ripened, then its result happens in our mind stream. And this is what we're experiencing continually. It's what we've always experienced in the past. It's what we're experiencing now, and it's what will be experienced in the future as we continue to plant the seeds of our intention. So this is what His Holiness was talking about, karma and emptiness. Here he's talking about the nature of how our consciousness, our mental, moment by moment existence facilitates through misapprehension. Because let's go back to saying this, that most of us don't have that moment by moment realization that that's what's going on. Even if we did, what we're doing moment by moment is really what we're going to want to get after to change some of the patterns that have been created by the three poisons, by ignorance and its accompanying two friends, self-grasping or or aversion, where we're pushing things away from us. There's lots of laws in karmic, if you study karma closely, that relate to it. I mentioned one where once a karmic intent is planted in one's consciousness, it has to grow. It has to become bigger, so to speak, in terms of what germinated it. It never stays a seed. It always is actualized in some fully mature way. That's what we call the ripening process. That's what we call the result. when it's fully grown. And another one is that all actions of a certain quality and characteristic have to bear through that ripening process and through that maturation process and that resultant process, a similar result to its cause. You know, the intention being planted is the cause in one's mind stream, and then that process. That's another law of karma. So for example, I can't go out in my backyard right now while there's about still like 18 inches of snow. But if I could, I'd get an acorn and plant it and expect an apple tree to grow. It's just not possible. So this is that law of karma. And just to back up for a moment, not to talk too much about karma, but again, this is one of the foundational things we're trying to explore and understand in terms of what the wheel has to tell us in that inner circle. I just want to talk about kleshas. That's a Sanskrit word that in Buddhism are intentions that are mental states that function within a mental state. So one of these mental states of misapprehension, for example, being the primary one, that cloud the mind and manifest in unwhole actions. Kleshas include states of mind such as anxiety, fear, anger, jealousy, desire, depression. You can go on. So you could see why karma is so important to understand in the context of mental afflictions, or as it says here in what I'm reading from, states of mind. So, you know, contemporary translations use a variety of English words to describe what kleshas are, such as afflictions. That's one of my favorites. I've been using that a lot as we go through here. Some refer to them as defilements. It's what it is. Or destructive emotions, or disturbing emotions, or negative emotions, or mind poisons, or neurosis. But all of those things, I feel, fall short of what is really going on here. Like attraction, it is a state of mind, and maybe sort of as a subset of that, you could say that there are emotions we can attach to that, but there are other things that we could say are part of attraction that are not emotions. I don't like using the word emotions when I talk about the three poisons, because, or the three main afflictions. Again, my favorite word. And we can have a whole discussion about that, but it's really, I think, important to avoid getting stuck in the trap of thinking that we're just talking about our emotions. It goes way beyond that in terms of how these three mental states turn our experience of our world in one of those six flavors of those six realms we discussed last week into what we're experiencing moment by moment. So just sort of keep that in mind, that karma functions that way. There's other laws of karma we could talk about, but I think those are the important ones to underscore in a teaching like this, where we don't get too bogged down in what we're trying to go after here. So the other thing that we want to talk about, and His Holiness talks about this quite a bit in the reading that we have for this section, is the other concept, or should I say knowledge, of how life really works, that we talked about karma, and remember earlier I talked about emptiness and karma, or karma and emptiness. So His Holiness although he has said many times it's more important to understand how karma is working in our life moment by moment. And if you had to choose the two, between the two, it's more important to understand karma and to make it part of your mindfulness awareness moment by moment. But in reality, he does place a high value also on understanding sort of the nature of things, ourselves, and all phenomena. So even in this reading, which is like basically an introduction to Buddhist worldview, he goes right for talking about how things really exist. He says they are empty of inherent existence because they dependently arise. So that might be like, some of you have studied emptiness might be go, yeah, okay, I get that, check the box. But I think it's important to dig a little deeper than that. And I think what His Holiness asks us to do is to look at phenomena and how it is caused or happens moment by moment by cause and effect. But if you go deeper, and you might say, and maybe you're smarter than me and you asked this question already, well, why is that even possible to, why are we even talking about how life works in terms of cause and effect? It almost sounds like everything's preordained. Like you set the table and it unpacks itself from there, and you're riding down that torrent river, that intense stream of karmic ripening and results that you continually plant. Well, the answer to that is that everything is impermanent. Everything, it changes. We can all see that in our lives. We can see that in a big part of what we're trying to talk about here when we get to talking about the six realms, our mood, our outlook, what we're experiencing. And we'll go through a few exercises like that when we get into the other reading where David Nichtern gives us some simple examples of how you can experience one thing in a multiple of different ways. And from a moment by moment perspective, it's putting you in one of those six realms. So everything can change. Everything's impermanent. All of our emotions, all of our states of mind are not just things outside of us, ourselves, and all things change and have no permanence. So we can discuss, argue, try to find something that is permanent about ourselves or other objects. But basically what His Holiness is saying here, that objects, including ourselves, not having any inherent self-existence, what he really means is that it has no quality that's fixed, that is absolute, that this is it, and it doesn't change. Everything changes. We change. And we'll experience and look at that more intensely when we start to go through the 12 links of dependent origination. So, and it's cyclic, just like karma is planted, ripens, and then ends in a result. But that's ongoing, and it's unfathomable. It's just happening. So like, that's why His Holiness says it's so hard to understand karma. But what His Holiness says is that all of these phenomena, including ourselves, are empty of inherent existing. They have no fixed characteristic or quality that you could go, that's it. That's who you are. That's who I am. That's who the dog is. That's who that, you know, even when we just look at our own mental state in meditation or just sit quietly, it changes moment by moment. It's never fixed. Where is the I? Where is me? Where is the fixed quality of anything? And His Holiness says it's not there. It inherently does. There is no inherent meaning that something that exists fixed and is a quality that is tangible and has the characteristics of being that thing, that person. he says the punchline to that is, well, if it's not that could sound a little scary. He says it's nothing more, everything is nothing more than dependently arising. And what that really means is that every moment by moment reality, as we were just talking about how karma ripens moment by moment, is occurring in existence in every realm within all of ourselves as individuals and collectively, and all of the phenomena of our environment. It's only arising in dependence upon each other. Everything's rising in dependence upon something else. Like even me giving this this talk today, this teaching today, it's only dependent on the fact that you're all there. Otherwise, I would be crazy. I'd just be sitting here talking to myself, which I'm known to do. I don't think I'm crazy though. So, you know, you could go into meditative exercises to sort of discover that statement to be true that His Holiness shared with us about how things don't have a fixed quality. But I think, as much as I said, gives us some understanding that this is what we're talking about here when we pull back and we talk about ignorance or misapprehension. Misapprehension of what? Of reality, of everything that's going on in our own inner dialogue, our own inner narrative, moment by moment, as being something that has a quality of existing in a fixed way. It doesn't. It's always changing. And it only arises in dependence upon other things, other people, other phenomena, our environment. And it's like I said before, an unfathomable experience going on moment by moment throughout all of existence that creates the world we live in. Those 6 realms that are in the wheel of life. That's why they come out from the center where we have the 3 poisons, those 3 mental afflictions. If we didn't have them, the rest of the wheel couldn't exist. Because the entire wheel, the entire expression of existence as expressed in the 6 realms, propelled by the 12 links of dependent origination, only are possible because of the constant misapprehension of how life works or the true nature of reality. That's why this is so important to talk about. That's why I didn't want to just have one session where we cover all the parts of the wheel and we talk about what the inner part of the wheel means and the outer and in the between. So one could that could possibly lead one to sort of have a nihilistic rational thought about, well, if nothing inherently self-exists, well, that means nothing exists. And that's kind of scary. Of course, the counterweight to that is everything exists intrinsically and has a fixed nature. Those are the 2 extreme ways of looking how things really exist. And one thing that Buddhism does have to offer is a middle ground. In Mahayana Buddhism, it's called the middle way. It's avoiding the 2 extremes of everything existing self-existently inherently is fixed, or things don't exist at all. And that middle way is, and His Holiness talks about this a lot, David Nichtern talks about this a lot in his book as well, it's dependently arising. That's what life is. It's all dependent. That's the middle ground. It isn't that things don't function. It isn't that things don't have an aspect. Function meaning, like, you know, what we're doing right now. You know, we're doing a session on Zoom, and Zoom functions as a software that allows us. That's real. It functions. And its aspect is that it's this thing called Zoom. But what's its nature? That's what we're talking about. You know, there's 3 things like I've habitually gotten used to thinking about every time I experience an object. What's its nature? What's its aspect? What's its function? Always has a function in cyclical existence or samsara. But the one thing that most of us miss the boat on is what's its true nature. And that informs how we look at it in its aspect. Do we grasp it? Do we avert it? Do we ignore it? And then does that perpetuate a state of mind in one of the 6 realms that puts us someplace that creates suffering? Maybe there's a way to explore first understanding how life really works, what's the true nature of things, and going from there, transforming that in a way that lessens self-grasping, lessens aversion to things, puts us more in a place of equanimity based on that knowledge. Also coupled with that knowledge is an understanding of how how karma works. And knowing that things are not inherently self-existent, karma is not so scary either. If we follow the middle way and we think about everything being dependently arising, but at the same time, because they don't have their own fixed existence, fixed quality, all things can change. That's not a bad thing. That means that self-grasping can change into compassion, like I was talking about earlier. It means that having aversion or hatred in an emotional sense to certain objects or things can change, because there isn't anything in anyone else that is a fixed quality of like, that I could look at and go, that's it, I hate you, because you have that quality. That's only coming from you. It's only dependently arising in that moment between you and that other person, or you and that object. That's what we're exploring here. If we can understand karma, understand that things do not have a fixed quality, then we can understand that possibly what His Holiness is saying, that everything just dependently arises, we can benefit by that. Karma isn't so scary, so fixed. It's actually kind of exhilarating, that if that's how things work, I can work with my moment by moment experience of life, that those intentions that populate my conscious stream, that soil, that fertilized, that gets fertilized by other qualities. Maybe if they're more informed, those qualities that I populate my karmic, existence with, I can have better mental states of existence. While we're here, we're not just talking about trying to get out of the wheel. Remember last time we talked about the wheel as a complete representation of all existence. Now, ultimately, from a practicing Buddha's point of view, a goal is to be able to conquer, transform suffering existence into one that is happy. And the only way to do that is to exit the wheel, to get out of those 6 realms. Remember, we're not just talking about meaning between lifetimes, being able to jettison and out of this thing. We're talking about hour by hour, minute by minute, week by week. We can transform how we experience life. Ultimately, for a Buddhist, it's to move past these 6 realms. So don't think about it in the sense of literally having to, as we're trying to look at this more in a modern and contemporary way, just exiting those 6 realms from the point of view of getting literally out of them, from a cosmology point of view, a structure of existence point of view. So a little bit there. I'm sure there's some questions about that, but I did want to paint put the important spotlight on the understanding misapprehension of reality, and what are the two sort of intellectual or reasoned, logical elements of what reality really is that we can talk about that might inform us to move us away from that misapprehension. And those two things are understanding karma, how it works, and understanding the true nature of things, everything being impermanent. And that really everything's a middle way, if you will, as Mahayana Buddhism expresses it. And that is labeled as something that all things are dependently arising. All things in existence. So when we talk about dependent arising, I just want to talk a little bit about how that fundamentally works. There's three levels to dependent arising. One level is that there is an understanding that we have a experience of something, and it comes on our horizon mentally, where we are able to acknowledge it's there. At that level, there's just this connection between yourself and this object. The next level is saying something to yourself like, I really like that. I really like that object. I want that object. So that takes us to another level of engagement with the object. We've now started to project on that object that it has some quality, inherently self-existing, that I, who's also inherently self-exists, want to have it. I want to own that. Then the third level is you buy it and you make it your own. And in the process of doing that, to jump over to David Nichtern, he talks about that when he talks about the process of grasping. He talks about that being something that is almost insidiously, moment by moment, shapes our environment, our individual environment. Something that's ours shapes our individual environment. And what's it do with everything else? It leaves it outside of that. And this is how we get into a realm of actually being in one of those realms of existence. And then he talks about the opposite of that, where you purposely don't bring into your realm of experience those things that you want to own or grasp. And those create the boundaries, even in a more hardened way, between things that your world and your possessions are about and everything else is outside of that. All of a sudden we have discrimination. We have other qualities that amplify the realm of grasping and aversion. And they're all informed by thinking that these things have real inherent qualities. And this is how you project yourself into one of those realms. It's all by dependence coming from your conscious mind stream to having some engagement with something. It could be an object, it could be a person. David uses an example of like a blue jay, where you love a blue jay and you bring that experience of that object of the blue jay into your environment. It's yours, even though you don't own it. And then the more obvious one is like where you fall in love with someone. And then that really is something that solidifies in your environment. And that could lead to, if you grasp onto that so tightly, that could lead to you feeling emotions of envy and jealousy and distrust and other types of mental afflictions, because you are mislabeling in your dependent arising in connection with that person who they are, what their true nature is, and how they become part of your world and in what way they become part of your world. So this is really an important thing for us to understand. It's all about being in that inner circle and understanding the true nature of ignorance or misapprehension and trying to turn that into knowledge or wisdom of how things really work. So, you know, we could talk more about that. In the reading by His Holiness, there's a whole section in the pages that I assigned for those of you who read. So I just want to acknowledge this, that he takes the conversation in this section on the Buddhist worldview. Once he gets finished talking about inherent existence and dependent arising, he takes it into a discussion of the 12 links of origination. I'm skipping that. It's actually pretty long. It's 3 or 4 pages in the reading, if you will. But really, we'll circle back to those. So it's not like I'm forgetting about them. That's really sort of important to remember. And similarly, I'll be circling back to talking in the next session much more in a focused way about the circle right outside of the circle of the 3 poisons or 3 mental afflictions, which are the positive and negative circle. But right now, I think what I want to do is spend some time going into a little bit of a discussion before it gets too late about what His Holiness circles back to after he talks in that reading about the 12 links. He talks a lot about the 3 poisons, so I don't have to repeat what he said because I kind of put a big spotlight on that. But I really encourage everyone here to read closely, if you have the book, The Wheel of Life by His Holiness, to read closely pages 44 through the bottom of page 47. So it's only 3 or 4 pages, but it really amplifies what I've been talking about in terms of understanding how important ignorance is or misapprehension. It is the chief afflictive mental state. It's why in the diagram, many of the diagrams, not all of them, but many of them, you'll see out of the mouth of the pig comes the other 2 mental afflictions of attraction and aversion. It's because without ignorance, you can't have those happen. So wisdom or knowledge becomes a direct antidote to, if you think about it logically, ending suffering existence. Because without that, you can't have the other 2 main mental afflictions of attraction and aversion, which lead to the positive and negative experiences in life that the next circle represents, and next the 6 realms of existence, and then on the outer rim, the 12 links of dependent origination. I mean, that's how, you know, damn important understanding ignorance is and its role. So the other thing the things that he talks about there are the 2 types of ignorance. One is intellectual, where you just don't have the opportunity to put your mind to doing what we're all doing right now to some degree. I'm maybe doing an okay job. Hopefully some of it makes some sense to you, which is intellectually trying to process an understanding of misapprehension. And then the other one is what he calls innate. So innate is like when your consciousness is just going about its business of misapprehending, misconceiving phenomena. As I've been talking about existing under, he uses an expression, existing under its own power. I talked about it existing independently, existing where it has its own fixed quality that never changes. So those, he's underscoring what I was talking about, but it's so important to understand intellectually ignorance or misapprehension that I really encourage you to study it closely and to do some real reflection on it. And in other sessions, I'll be leading us in some meditative practices that will help underscore the sort of muscle to develop an awareness of that. It's quite important. So those two types he explores on pages 40 and 45 in the print edition. He talks more about what I was just talking about, how desire, he calls it desire and hatred. I don't like to use those words. I like to use attraction and aversion as mental afflictions. But we could see on an emotional level how desire and how hatred, in terms of an emotional actualization of those mental afflictions could be, you could label them that. So yeah, that's he talks a lot about that. There's one thing that is sort of really important to understand. Actually, it took me years to get this. So even just saying that it's important to understand, and then I'm going to say it about karma, and how things exist. The way His Holiness puts it, he talks about how the conception of inherent existence, in other words, thinking something has some fixed quality, acts as the cause, right? So that's the cause when we talk about karma, inducing the desire in this case, let's say self-grasping. So that part's not so hard to get, but from a karmic ripening point of view, what's important is to understand that they don't exist exactly at the same time. One follows the other, which is why understanding karma is so important. You have to have the misapprehension first, where you actually grab onto thinking something inherently exists. And if you don't do that, when you do that, that's the fertilizer, that's the intention that innately, you're not mentally processing this. And intention doesn't have to be well thought out. It could be coming from an habitual place of patterned experience of grasping onto something or having aversion to something. But once you wrap yourself in thinking and experiencing things as inherently existing or having a fixed quality, that is the actual cause. He says that's the cause of having the rest of all the mental afflictions happen, primarily attraction and aversion, and everything else, the 84,000 other mental afflictions just ripple from that in our day-to-day, moment-by-moment experience. So that's like super important to get. And from a karmic processing point of view, they don't happen at the same time. One has to come first, and that's the cause, and the other has to be the result. That's why understanding ignorance or misapprehension of reality is so important to understand, because without that thing I said a few moments ago, we could do like a whole Tibetan debate about, without the presence of ignorance, is suffering existence possible? You know, or is it totally dependent on that? His Holiness seems to be indicating here that without it, it undercuts all of it. Like you take out the hub, you take the pig out of the hub of the wheel, and the hub dissolves. And without the hub of a wheel, you know this with any wheel, it's going to fall apart. It's going to dissolve. It's going to break apart. your wheel is going to have no integrity. If it's a wheel on your car, somehow the hub breaks off, the wheel's going to break, and you're stuck on the side of the road. So in this case, though, if you dissolve ignorance, it dissolves suffering existence. So that's a pretty powerful thing to say. So His Holiness sort of finishes up that section talking about the other two powerful streams that I've already talked about that are connected to ignorance, which are attachment and aversion. And he ends where I wanted to end that section on the bottom of page 47, where he talks about that concept again about ignorance being the main culprit that assists in the ripening and resulting of desire and hatred, as he calls it. And he ends it by saying that in this way, the cause of all the trouble in existence is the pig. And he goes on to say that, isn't it interesting that in the Tibetan calendar year of his birth, that was a year of the pig. So he's being a little self-deprecating there. Yeah. So, that's kind of the section of the talk today that I gleaned from that section of His Holiness's book. Before we go to any sort of Q&A section, I want to just talk about David Nichtern's reading. His focus in his presentation of the wheel has a big focus on the 6 realms of, as he calls them in his book. I'll call them the 6 realms of existence. And the reason he does that is because as he's trying to relate it to contemporary life experience, that's where we're all at, again, whether it's from lifetime to lifetime, as Buddhists think, or it's in this lifetime from moment to moment, minute by minute, hour to hour, day by day, we're in one of those 6 realms. So one of his main motivations and intent in writing his book was to address that specifically. So there's a lot of value there, but I have to present, and the reason today I presented so much about the inner circle before I move to talking about, the 6 realms as David Nichtern focuses on in his work, is because I believe, as I've said 20 times in this session already, that you have to have that understanding. You have to develop that wisdom mentally before you can start to put into practice some changes. Got to understand karma. You have to understand how things really exist. Now, David starts to talk about all of this within the 6 realms of existence. He smartly talks about how if we're quiet, and all of us who might meditate know that one of the first things it's hard to move away from is that what David calls that internal dialogue in our own heads that are going on constantly. I call it the stream of karmic ripening that's happening all the time. In Buddhist cosmology, I mentioned this last week, it's identified as karmic ripenings in an individual happens 64 times per finger snap, very quickly. So there's a lot going on. He calls that from a more contemporary point of view, he calls that our inner dialogue. It's the story that we're constantly building. What's it built on? It's built on this misapprehension of how things really work. So he talks about, for example, again, he's putting it in the context of the realms. He talks about the jealous God realm. The mind has some type of ongoing dialogue that has at its nature, always doing comparison and evaluation and being very competitive. That causes jealousy to continually play out. That's one of the main mental afflictive states that one has when you're in the jealous God realm. Remember, the jealous God realm is the realm in the wheel where, excuse me, the jealous gods are looking up literally at the God realm and going, damn, I want that, I want that, I want that. They're never happy. There's jealousy, envy going on all the time. And we all know states that we have in our own life throughout the day, throughout the time frames we might be able to identify. And these are things that we can look at, these kinds of qualities of where am I? Which realm am I in? And you can see it when you're going into meditation or sitting and just reflecting with that being what you put in the front of your mind. What am I feeling? So, he's pointing out as an example that that's kind of what's going on in the so-called jealous God realm. He talks about the hell realms. That's like an endless repeated pattern of hardship, complaints, regrets, endless. It never stops. So there's no ability to move out of that realm. And I think we all know some people, hopefully none of us, and hopefully, none of us, have had to go through this, but I'm sure we've all had periods where we've experienced a continual stream of hardship or complaints or regrets. Again, in our inner dialogue, not coming at us from outside. And then in the human realm, he talks about that as being a realm of always strategizing, figuring out relationships, how to get ahead in our career, how to do X, Y, and Z. So these are kind of the realms that are considered higher realms. And he points out that they're created through, which we can call our environment, right? Those realms are our environment, how we're interacting with those realms as being shaped. Listen to this, as a reflection of our mind. So one of the Buddhist representations of the wheel that I showed you last week, but I neglected to point it out, was one that was actualized by a Zen Buddhist artist. And it specifically says that the wheel is a reflection of your mind. So what David's sort of saying is that dependently arising, any one of the moment by moment states of or realms that you might find yourself in are shaped as a reflection of your mind, or happening dependently on what that inner dialogue is calling to the front of your mind. So he's identifying what we need to work on, just to pull back for a second, working on that inner dialogue, changing it, understanding it could be changed, and changing its qualities of experience from negative, mental, afflictive, or emotional experiences to something, again, that might be an antidote to it or counter to it, like self-grasping. Counter to that is compassion. Then this is what we're looking for. But he talks about something else that's really important, which I'll get to in a second. And it's something that he identifies that happens in the meditative process. And I want to further identify what that is. I think it gives meaning to, like, why would we sit on a cushion and do deep breathing and try to put ourselves in a neutral state, which was one of the meditations we did last week. So he basically says that all these 6 realms are a loop of our internal landscape or our internal dialogue and our external situation. They reinforce each other, setting in play what realm we might be in from moment to moment. He talks about different filters of mood, tone, and quality. These are all part of the reading that he, that I gave you guys, suggested to you guys as to partake in. Further, he talks about each realm being contours of our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, which in turn shape expectations and new experiences as they arise. Again, that's another way of talking about dependent arising, whether it's what has already happened that sets the table, or what's happening right now, or what's happening in the future. The way we interact with ourselves internally within our own dialogue, and how we dependently arise in connection with our environment, others, other phenomena, other things, other types of sentient beings. This is what shapes everything. You know, the underlying tone. He calls things like anxiety, pain, craving, envy, and even happiness and bliss. He calls those tones. And he says, which I said sort of earlier, that they're really hard to notice in your normal sort of coming and going moment by moment every day. He talks about how hard it is to see these things during our waking life. Sometimes we see them in our dream life, but then we forget them. But his point is that the wheel's imagery offers us a view into how life works, and how to recognize how to use certain methods for changing it from what he calls a daydream into a waking state. Why I call these sessions Wake Up Now. So that's what we're trying to do here. And it all starts with waking up from misapprehension. That's why I harped on that so much today. There's some other things I could mention. You know, he does a whole exercise in the second part of the reading on page 89 in the print edition that I recommended everyone read. And he's talking about karma, but he does a whole exercise of how it could be a completely different experience just eating chocolate ice cream, and what it could bring to you if you're like, so for example, in the God realm, the experience of eating ice cream it's just perfect. It's like totally pleasurable. It's perfect. It's the best ice cream. It has the best taste. It has the best texture. I mean, everything about it, including not gaining weight and having agita from it or getting cholesterol and all those negative things. And so that's a godlike experience of eating chocolate ice cream. A jealous God realm is like, man, this chocolate ice cream I got at the store, I mean, it's not the one I wanted. I wanted this other brand. And this one's not as smooth. It doesn't have the right texture. It has sort of a chalky texture. And I really want some ice cream. I'll eat it, but it's just really unhappy. So, but it's a God realm because they could have chocolate ice cream like that. They just can't get exactly the kind they want. And the human realm, it's a little different. And then we go down to the other realms, and it's a further exploration of how we experience eating chocolate ice cream. So for those of you who haven't read this section, I really encourage you to do so. I'm skipping over some stuff, but the one thing I want to talk about is meditation before we do a Q&A. And meditation is really important, and it goes beyond what I talked about earlier, where we are able to identify what is going on, and that if you can do that, that's really important. But it's the most important aspect of it is identifying it from a point of view where we're not labeling the experience with these characteristics, these mental afflictive characteristics. If we can't reach a place in meditative practice where the object is not only, as I talked about earlier, where we analyze it and stabilize it and get to know it experientially, we have to do it in a way where it brings us into a place where I don't want to say neutral, but I do want to say where we're not slapping all kinds of labels on it. So this is something that David talks a lot about. And one of the things he does, and I think people who do mindfulness meditation or similar kind of practices can relate to this, but he talks about going into meditative space where rather than analyzing or even stabilizing an object of meditation, you find a place through the meditative process where he calls it, you find the gap. So this is like, in his description, he calls it finding the gap between thoughts, the gaps between, those mental processes that we're normally experiencing, and staying there. And to me, learning how to stay in the gap is similar to understanding how important it is to not label things with a quality, especially one that is of a mental afflictive nature, that it has inherent existence, that I like it or I hate it, or I don't even care about it, which is indifference. It's different than feeling neutral or equanimity towards it. The gap is in certain meditation practices, insight meditation and others, it's called being in a place of open awareness. And I equate that space of open awareness to being in a place where one can feel open, spacious, happy, relieved of the experience in that moment of any of the mental afflictions. And I equate that to being an experience of the true nature of how things really are, experientially. So it's another way to meditate that's different than doing an analytical meditation and following it with a stabilizing meditation. That requires having an object of meditation. So David's, comes from a school which is slightly different than mine. He comes from a school of Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, but it's a different school. But this type of meditation is really important. So I think it's a way that is really helpful in thinking about, why do I want to sit on a cushion, and why do I want to find a place like that? And that's kind of like what we were doing a little bit of last week when we talked about, finding that meditative place that's away from the extremes of desire and hatred. And it's also a place that helps, I think, with the main topic today, which is how to move away from the constant torrent, the inner dialogue that has its germination moment by moment, coming from the three poisons or the three mental afflictions, especially misapprehension of reality. So there's a lot more that I could cover on the topic, but I think that really covers most of what I wanted to cover today. So I wanted to leave a little time. It's 11:30 in case anybody has any questions. That would be good. Anybody have any questions? I don't see any on the chat, so maybe everybody is falling asleep, or I explained things so well that there couldn't possibly be any questions whatsoever. Somebody asked, what school of Buddhism is David? He's part of a tradition that comes from Tibetan Buddhism. It's called, the school's called Shambhala, and it has teachers that have their anchor in what's called sort of ecumenism. So it's not one school. Tibetan Buddhism has four main traditional schools. There's many. It's no different than Christianity, how there's so many branches of Christianity, but there's four main schools. And the Shambhala teachings are sort of a blend. And that doesn't mean watered down. It means that it takes a certain view where it blends all of Buddhist practices together, including Theravada Buddhism, which isn't even part of Tibetan Buddhism. It's part of the Pali tradition. So, very expansive and broad, and I think lends itself to why David was, I mean, I don't know this, it's not that I asked him, but that he could write a contemporary work on the wheel because it's sort of in the flow of how that school processes and thinks about Buddhism. So there are a few questions now. So Rachel, you said you have 2 questions. Do you want to turn your mic on?
At least two, John. But I'll just stick with 2. Can you give a little bit more specific explanation? Give me an example of what you said about looking at something like, let's say, a flower, and you say you do 3 things. You say what's its nature, what's its aspect, and what's its function. Can you give me a more specific example of something, simple, maybe a flower or whatever you think? That's the first question.
Sure. From a Buddhist cosmology point of view, everything has all 3. And a good practitioner would first understand its nature. So if we took a flower, I was a good husband. I bought some flowers for my wife for Valentine's Day. So I have a picture of a flower in my mind. I bought a dozen yellow roses because when we got married, that's what we had. We had yellow roses at our wedding, and it was in February too. Anyway, so if I look at a yellow rose, it brings up all those kinds of thoughts that I just was blabbering on about. But when I settle my mind and I look at its true nature, and I look for it, I can't find it. There's nothing that I could find that goes beyond its impermanent characteristics, that it arises, comes into existence, exists for some period of time, and then it dies. It arises dependently on a lot of things. We can go into like machinations of like how roses are grown and how they're cut and brought to market, and then people experience buying them and experiencing the way I was just talking about. But ultimately, that's its true nature. Number one, its true nature, that it doesn't have any inherent self-existence. It only has dependent arising existence in time and space, like I was just describing it, only those things. Yet it has a specific aspect. It arises as a rose, a yellow rose, and and I can see what that is. I can experience that in my own mental arising of engaging with it. And that's the aspect of the object that's being observed and the person, in this case, observing it. And then there's its function. Its function is to, for me, and it might be different for you because you might hate yellow roses, or they might mean something completely different for you. They bring forth beauty and color and happiness for some people, maybe not for others. That goes back to its nature, which is it has no fixed nature. It doesn't make, or yellow rose doesn't make everybody happy. Seeing a blue jay, like David Nectarine talked about, doesn't make everybody happy and want to have a blue jay around all the time. Somebody else's blue jay might be, terrorize its garden, and kill the chipmunks that, are in the garden, which blue jays are known to do. So it has a function, but even that is only independent arising experience with that person who's engaged with it. It can't just be fixed and on its own. So it's functional. Just like I can't say, because a car is empty of any inherent existence, and yeah, it appears like a car, but because it's empty, I don't have to worry about like stepping in front of a car. If I do, I'm gonna get hurt. because it has a function of being this big metal object that rolls down the street at a high speed, you know? So you could go on and on about any object or any part of an object and identify its nature, identify its aspect, and identify its function. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Let me see if I've got this. If I understood it or not. I think you said you're talking about exiting the wheel or the six realms, and you said, you know, one more traditional way is to be exiting in a cosmological existence point of structure. But if you're not using that traditional idea, what would you mean by moving out of the six realms? Like, what would that look like? I don't understand that.
Yeah. And that goes more to like what I was hoping. I'm glad you asked that question, because it goes more to what I hope to convey in this set of sessions. And for us who don't have to think about like what's our cosmological compass, and also what's our cosmology from the point of like view of existence of like heaven and hell and other realms, and where are we headed after we die? Do we come back or not? Do we go to heaven? Forget all that. And I mean that literally. In the context, putting that aside, which we talked about last week, where the Buddha is standing outside the wheel and pointing to the moon, which stands for liberation. And from a Buddhist point of view, that's important. And in other representations of the wheel, traditionally, the Buddha is actually, there's an image of the Buddha in each one of the six realms, because he's there to help. That has to do with addressing the topic of compassion related to the six realms. Putting all that aside, the idea is that if one can work with understanding how life really works, what the true nature of reality is, and start to sort of, within the context of how things happen moment by moment, meaning karmically, cause and effect, and utilize that knowledge, doing certain meditative practices, where you can get to a point where they create that open awareness, and then that leads to direct knowledge and experience of life in those realms. Let's focus on the six realms in a way that is different, all starting with sort of dissolving ignorance, because without that, they don't hold up. Then moment by moment, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, one rationally and logically should be able to reach a point where you are experiencing your life happy and blissful, without the acute suffering that you previously experienced because you were misapprehending how everything actually takes place. So it's mindfulness, awareness, and an evolution experientially, where that one can move substantially beyond the six realms, where you're mindful, where it's like, oh, I'm not really feeling that I'm having any of these mental afflictions. I'm feeling open and spacious. I'm feeling really happy. I'm engaging with people with that awareness. So that's the idea of what I wanted this class to be, to some great extent, actually, is to hopefully bring forth these concepts where they could be utilized in that way. Because again, this class isn't just for Buddhists. It's really meant to be tools that people can use. So it's not literally exiting the six realms cosmologically speaking, but rather exiting misapprehension and everything that stems from it, transforming your daily life.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Janet, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. So I would love it if you could say something more about karma and intention, causes and conditions, and how they all interact, because I think we all know the experience of setting out to do something with what we believe are our best intentions, and then having things really can go terribly amok, or they just don't work out as, you know. So how would you explain to people what's all at work? Is that the dependent origination and the misapprehension of reality, how that all ties together, why we can feel like we're doing things with the best of intentions and putting forth the best actions, and still things oftentimes don't go as we had hoped.
Yeah. Well, that gets to, it's a great question. It gets to why it's so important to understand not only the true nature of reality, but the other part of that, how life works, from how is in the sense of understanding how karma works. Karma is, as I talked about earlier, works where the intention, that's the volition that the Buddha talks about, that one moves forward with the movement of your mind to either have a thought, to speak something, or to take an action, where it plants a seed and then it has to grow. It has to. That's a law of karma. Something planted in that way has to grow and it will become bigger. But one of the other laws of karma is that it doesn't happen instantly. There's no such thing as instant karma. So one can be existing in time and space where, let's say you're studying these sort of practices and you're doing certain practices and you're doing some transformation. Both His Holiness and David talk about this in their books. It doesn't happen right away. It takes time. You know, so what happens, and this is where His Holiness talks about how karma is so much harder to understand than emptiness. It's so unfathomable. The amount of karmic ripening that you as an individual, I as an individual consciousness, all of us are experiencing is interweaving, overlapping, happening, self-contained sort of within yourself and those things that you're interacting with, that when you're trying to set a plan, make an intention, look for the execution of that intention through certain kinds of practices that happen, they don't happen right away. And it's one of the sobering realities of how karma works in our lives. One of the things that is an antidote to that, there are certain practices that are an antidote to that, but we you know, it's not really something we can talk about in this class at this moment. But suffice to say that what's really important to understand is that one has to study these sort of frameworks of understanding that the wheel has to offer, do certain practices with certain understanding. The more wisdom you do the practices with, meaning the knowledge of how things really are, what their true nature are, then results do come faster. But you do always have ripening karma from the past, whether we're talking about just in this lifetime or from previous lifetimes and all of that stuff. It takes time. And there's always ripening karma going on at the same, you know, from the past that you've planted, that is sort of banging into your current activity of purposeful and skillful and wisdom-filled practices that where you're trying to reshape and change your karma. And it's not like it's a crapshoot, but it is unpredictable. And therefore, when you do these sorts of practices based on knowledge and firm conviction, once you gain that knowledge, like going back to what I talked about last week, where you take a course from somebody who knows what they're talking about and you have a lot of faith in that, you still have to question. The more you practice, the more you firm up your conviction and faith in the practice. And that's the point, you have to develop those things. If you don't have those things, you know, you might lose your effort, your interest, you know, because it doesn't happen right away. You know, if instant karma existed, I would, you know, I would be able to go out on Fifth Avenue, shoot somebody, and I might turn around and I'd get shot instantly as a direct result of that. Or maybe something a little more mundane. I see a cockroach on my stove and I take my shoe and go, boom, I flatten it. Well, if if karma worked really quickly, I should be flattened in some way immediately. I will get flattened some way. Be creative when I say that. I don't mean literally, but that karma has been planted for that action, both those actions, and it takes time to ripen. And the more powerful the intent and the volition of it, the quicker and more strongly it could ripen. So hopefully that helps.
It does. I mean, I think about the causes and conditions needing to be appropriate and dependent arising. Maybe even thinking of what you spoke of earlier about the 18 inches of snow in your backyard. We have to wait for the conditions to be appropriate. We have to understand that conditions are always changing little by little. And one day those are going to be, daffodils sprouting in your backyard instead of 18 inches of snow.
Yeah.
So, okay, thank you.
Okay. There's a question from Karen. In the context of nature, aspect, and function, would you explain aspect? So I was talking a little bit about that earlier with Rachel's question. Aspect really has to do with appearance. Like, what aspect does an object take in its rising independence on how my mind's experiencing it? So it's as simple as that. It's like when I look at a car and I see it as a car, that experience is its aspect. And then, as I explained earlier, its function is the kind of things we know about a car. But its nature is like the thing we really want to focus on, from my point of view, in the context of this particular teaching, as today we were talking about misapprehension. And what is it? It's not it misapprehending its aspect or its function. Those are a little bit more tangible. It's more misapprehending its nature, its true nature. That help?
Yes, thanks, John.
Okay. Bernadette asks, how can we understand karma on a collective level, like the pandemic, 9/11? Is that happening to us individually, and as a collective, is there collective karma? The simple answer is yes. Karma, as I said earlier, is so unfathomable and so complex, and is going on throughout all samsaric existence. Karma is ripening from a Buddhist point of view, among all sentient beings, not just humans. And it's going on all the time, like I said, Buddhist cosmology, 64 every finger snap for every sentient being. The complexities of that are not, in individual silos. It's all collective. The world we live in is all shaped by collective karmic experience and ripening and results and ongoing causal planting, if you will, of kleshas. And it's one of the reasons that I think it's so important to see the empowering aspect of understanding karma and emptiness and how transformative it can be. Because if you can transform that individual karma and then know that through great teachers, not me, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, my teachers, people who dedicate their life to this, that's their goal. They know how powerful this is. So again, it isn't just about exiting this world, it's about transforming this world. One of the great, exercises in understanding karma and what it does is, like, when you see pictures from space that show the Earth, what don't you see? You don't see any borders. Remember what I was talking about before about grasping and creating environments and creating borders, keeping with you everything that's yours and keeping out from you everything that's not you. That's what literally creates borders. That's what creates countries. That's what creates everything, that if you stop and really think about it. And when you look at a picture of planet Earth from space where none of that's present, it's a lesson in the true nature of Mother Earth, that we create all that. It's not created. It's not created. It's not there. It's an illusion. And we do that collectively. We don't do that individually. You know, Mexicans are all Mexicans, and they see a border, and we see a border between us and them, and on and on and on. And experience like a pandemic or 9/11 is all a shared experience. Anyone who experiences it, or the level of intensity might be different. Like my brother-in-law was in the #2 tower when the plane hit. I was up on 46th Street in my office watching what was going on a TV. So my experience was different, but we have to varying degrees, we have shared experiences. So when it goes beyond, anything goes beyond an individual, it's collective. If you were a fan of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers who won the Super Bowl last week, that's collective karma. Everything is karmic ripening. And when it's experienced by more than one individual, it's collective to some degree then. Hopefully that helps. We have one more question, and then we're getting to the end here, from Laura. Is the purpose of emptiness to allow phenomena to arise and function to create a reality? If not for emptiness as the basis, nothing would arise or be able to change. I read that as a statement, but Laura put it as a question, that second part. So when we think about a purpose of emptiness, it isn't that there's a purpose, and not to mince words with you, because it's a really good question. It's that is what the true nature of all phenomena is. It's empty. That just is. And it's through that being the true nature of all phenomena, to your question, that things can arise and function. It's only because of that they can arise and function, which is the second part of your question, but actually I read it like a statement because that's part of the answer. So dependent arising and emptiness are two sides of the same coin. One cannot be without the other. One cannot function without the other. One cannot be without the other. So that's something to, and it's part of why you could also say emptiness and karma are two sides of the same coin, because karma is nothing more than dependent arising within the definition of a little bit more mechanically how we utilize intentions in a misapprehended way. What we're trying to do is not misapprehend things and experience them in a enlightened or wisdom-filled way, and thereby transforming them. So hopefully that answers your question, Laura. So that finishes the questions. And as much as I tried, I made my presentation too long, which I cut back. I allowed enough time for questions, thank goodness, but we're at 12 o'clock. And if everybody wants to do a short meditation, we can, or we can go right to ending the teaching with a dedication. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I'd love to stay on and do a meditation. It would be great.
Okay, so as a counterbalance, we'll do this quickly. As a counterbalance to all this talk about inherent self-existence and karma, kind of twisting our brains, if you will, and a good antidote to that, or sort of a nice sort of balm you can put on that is doing a compassion meditation, compassion-oriented meditation. So there's a whole series of meditations that I learned that go to the development of compassion. And one of there's a series that you can do that go in a certain order. So I'm going to take one part of that meditation, which is called Equalizing Oneself with Others. There's also a meditation called Exchanging Oneself with Others, but we're not going to do that. That comes later, and we'll do these over the coming weeks. So we'll do the first one called Equalizing Oneself with Other, and I'll walk us through it. And so since we're short on time, though, let's do a quick calming down. Sit, comfortably erect, preferably. Those who do meditation sit in a meditation posture, and calm yourself by slowing down your breath, focusing on your breath going in and out, trying to empty the breath where there isn't an inner dialogue going on as you inhale and exhale, slowing it down. And with that state, listen to what I have to say. So this is Equalizing Oneself with Others. It's a meditation on equanimity. It's a 9-round meditation that is the first part is a round where we visualize cultivating equanimity from the viewpoint of others, from the viewpoint of others. Number 1, develop the thought that all sentient beings are equal insofar as the natural wish to avoid suffering is concerned, and that therefore there's no point in being partial or discriminatory. Follow that by reflecting that all sentient beings equally desire happiness, and therefore there's no ground for discriminating between them when working for their benefit. The situation is analogous to one where you encounter 10 equally wretched beggars who are desperately asking you to relieve their hunger. In such circumstances, it seems senseless to have any feeling of preference between them. Follow that by developing an equanimity based on the reflection that all sentient beings are equal in lacking genuine happiness, although they have the innate desire to possess it. Likewise, all sentient beings are the same in having suffering and, of course, wish to avoid it. So with the above 3 types of practice, train your mind in the attitude expressed as follows. I shall never discriminate between beings and will always work equally to help them overcome suffering and gain happiness. The next 3 rounds of meditation enforce the thought that there's no justification for discrimination between sentient beings from the point of view of oneself or from the viewpoint of others. So first, you might have the thought that although reflection upon the equality of others is fairly persuasive regarding the futility of your being discriminatory towards other beings, surely when viewed from your own side, the situation will look quite different. After all, some people are friends and help you. whereas many others harm you. To counter this thought, which attempts to give false ground for being partial towards others, reflect that all sentient beings are equally kind to you. They have all been at one time or another your closest friends and relatives. Hence, there's no rational basis at all for being biased towards or against any. Follow that by thinking perhaps you have the idea that although people have been your friends in the past, they have equally been your enemies and have caused harm as well. Such notions should be countered by reflecting that sentient beings' kindness to you is not confined to when they are friends and relatives alone. Their kindness, when they are your enemies, is boundless. The enemy provides you with the precious opportunity to train yourself in noble ideas of patience and tolerance, traits vital for the perfection of your generation of universal compassion. For a bodhisattva who emphasizes the practice of bodhicitta, the training in patience is indispensable. Contemplating upon such lines of reasoning will persuade you that there are no grounds for neglecting the welfare of even a single sentient being. Follow that by reflecting that, as Master Shantideva wrote in the Bodhisattva's Guide to a Way of Life, there's no sense in someone who is himself subject to suffering and impermanence being selfish and discriminatory towards others, who are also tormented by the same fate. And then the last round of 3 meditations that cultivate equanimity are as follows. Consider whether or not there are any true enemies in the real sense of the word. If there are, then the fully enlightened Buddhas should perceive them as such, which is definitely not the case. For a Buddha, all sentient beings are equally dear. Also, when you examine deeply, you'll find that it is in fact the delusions within the enemies and not the enemies themselves that actually cause harm. Buddhas see the delusions as enemies and not the childish who possess those delusions. Therefore, there's no justification at all for you to hold grudges against those who cause harm and neglect the welfare of such beings. Secondly, ask yourself whether these so-called enemies are permanent and will always remain as enemies, or whether they are changeable. Concluding that they are not permanent will enable you to overcome your disinterest in their welfare. The last meditation is a reflection upon the relative nature of enemy and friend and touches upon the ultimate nature of phenomena. Concepts of enemy, friend, and so forth are relative and exist only at the conventional level. They are mutually dependent, as are the concept of long and short. A person may be an enemy in relation to one person while at the same time being a dear friend to another. It is your misapprehension of friends, relatives, and enemies as inherently existent that give rise to your fluctuating emotions towards them. Therefore, by realizing that there is no such inherently existent enemy and friend, you'll be able to overcome your bias feelings towards all beings. So bring yourself back from your deep breathing, your relaxed state, and let's finish our teaching with a dedication. One note about this practice and other practices that I'm sharing with you, whether you might have them or not, I'll circulate a copy of this so that you may, if you like, participate at home on your own in doing that kind of practice. if it seems something that you might want to spend and explore more time with. Obviously, I went through them quickly as a way to show you the arc and scope of that particular 9-round meditation. Each one of the 9 is a specific meditation, obviously. So I will give a dedication. By the goodness of the deed I've just done, may all sentient beings complete the collection of merit and wisdom. And this gained with merit and wisdom create the ultimate bodies that wisdom and merit make. May what we've learned here today be wholly dedicated to the future well-being and happiness of all sentient beings, where there is no longer any suffering existence and only happiness and endless joy. So that does it for me. I'm not sure when the next class is. It's on the calendar at DNKL. It's in March, I think.
March 7th.
March 7th. So we have a couple of weeks break from listening to me, which is probably a relief on some level, and hopefully on another level, give you time to process what we talked about today. I encourage you to do the readings and do some further contemplation. There's lots of other readings I could give you if you're interested, related to this topic and specifically what we talked about today that I can send you. Just have to email me, and I'd be glad to, share other resources with you. But I think that's it for now.
John, will you be giving out readings for the next class like you did for this one?
Yeah, I will. I'll send them to different folks who might want to then help circulate them, like you did, Denise. Thank you, by the way. And then they'll also be posted at the DNKL website on the calendar for the next class, like Gloria did for this this class.
And if anybody, we might not have everybody's email, so if anybody wants to get the readings in an email form, maybe they should contact you, John, or any of us.
Sure. And you can always email me at diamondcutter@optimum.net.
Thank you so much, John.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Happy New
Thank you,
Year.
John.